Dead America, The Soldier, The Day After, Part 6, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. A voice called out from the parking lot, amplified by what sounded like a bullhorn. "We know you're in there. Send out Ralph and the rest of our people, and this doesn't have to get ugly." Davis looked at Flint. Flint looked back. "So much for the easy part," Flint said. Davis moved to the side of the window, pressing his back against the wall as he surveyed the parking lot. The 3 pickup trucks had formed a rough barricade across the front of the lot, and the armed men were spread out behind them in a loose semicircle. Their rifles were pointed at the store, but nobody was firing yet. "Morris, how's the back of the store look?" Davis asked into his radio. "Clear for now, Captain. No movement on the loading dock," Morris replied. Davis turned to Flint. "Get to a window on the east side. I need eyes on both flanks." Flint nodded and moved down the front of the store, staying low as he passed the checkout lanes. He found a spot near the corner where a narrow window gave him a view of the east side of the building. The lot on that side was empty, but he could see the strip mall they had used for cover earlier and the alley that led to the loading dock. The bullhorn crackled again. "You've got 1 minute. After that, we're coming in." Davis positioned himself near the front entrance where he could be heard without exposing himself. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "This is Captain Davis, United States Army. We are here on a federal mission, and I am ordering you to stand down and lower your weapons." A long pause followed. Then the bullhorn came back, the voice on it carrying a mocking edge. "Federal mission. That's what the last bunch said before they started dragging our people away. You've got 30 seconds, Captain." Davis looked over at Butler, who was crouched near the opposite window with his rifle ready. Silva was a few yards behind him, watching the civilians that Morris had moved toward the middle of the store. The employees huddled near the deli counter while the customers stood in a loose cluster by the canned goods aisle. The man in the hunting vest and the woman were at the back of the group, whispering to each other. "Captain, they're moving," Flint called out from his position. "2 of them just broke from the trucks and are heading east." "Trying to flank us," Davis said. Before anyone could respond, the first shot came from outside. The round punched through the front window, sending a shower of glass across the checkout area. Silva hit the deck as a second and third shot followed, the bullet slamming into the wall above his head and sending chunks of drywall raining down. "Return fire," Davis ordered. Butler and Davis opened up from their positions at the front windows, sending controlled bursts toward the trucks. The men outside scattered, some diving behind their vehicles while others returned fire from the gaps between them. The exchange was deafening, the sound of multiple rifles filling the store and bouncing off every hard surface until Flint's ears rang. Rounds punched through the remaining front windows, sending cascades of glass across the checkout area. One of the registers took a direct hit, the screen exploding in a burst of sparks and plastic. Behind them, the civilians who had been moved toward the center of the store dropped to the floor, some screaming and others crawling toward the back on their hands and knees. Silva fired several rounds from his position before pulling back to reload. A bullet struck the metal frame of the window he had been using, the impact sending a sharp ping through the air that made him flinch sideways. He slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle and moved to a different spot before popping back up. Flint kept his attention on the east side, watching for the 2 men who had broken off. He caught movement near the strip mall, 2 figures darting between the storefronts with rifles in their hands. They were heading for the alley. "Captain, the flankers are heading for the loading dock. They're going to try the back door," Flint reported. "Butler, go with Flint. Morris, hold the back," Davis ordered without taking his eyes off the parking lot. Butler broke from the window and ran toward Flint's position. The 2 of them moved quickly through the store, cutting down the center aisle toward the stockroom. The sounds of gunfire from the front faded slightly as they pushed deeper into the building, replaced by the hum of refrigerator units and the buzz of fluorescent lights. They pushed through the double doors into the stockroom and moved between the pallets toward the loading dock. Morris was positioned behind a stack of boxes near the roll-up doors, his rifle trained on the back exit. "Anything?" Flint asked. "Not yet, but I can hear them out there," Morris replied. Flint motioned for Butler to take a position on the right side of the dock while he moved to the left. They had a clear view of the back door, which was a heavy metal fire exit with a push bar. If the flankers tried to come through, they would be funneled into a tight space with 3 rifles waiting for them. But the door didn't open. Instead, Flint heard something that made his stomach drop. Voices coming from inside the store behind them, Not soldiers, and not the panicked murmurs of frightened civilians. These voices were hushed and purposeful, the sound of people trying not to be heard. Flint held up a fist, signaling the others to hold. He listened, tracking the sound to somewhere on the retail floor near the east wall of the building. A metallic scraping noise followed, like a door being forced open. "Stay here," Flint whispered to Morris. He tapped Butler on the shoulder and jerked his head back toward the store. The two soldiers slipped back through the double doors and into the retail area. Flint moved down a side aisle, using the tall shelving units for concealment as he tracked the sounds toward the east wall. Butler followed 3 steps behind, his rifle up and ready. As they rounded the end of the aisle, Flint froze. Halfway down the wall, a fire exit that he hadn't noticed before was propped open. Standing beside it were the man in the hunting vest and the woman who had been so vocal earlier. They were gesturing frantically, waving someone inside from the alley. 2 armed men squeezed through the doorway one after the other, both carrying rifles and moving with the focused energy of people who knew exactly what they were doing. The man in the vest pointed them toward the front of the store, and they began moving up the aisle in a low crouch. "Contact!" Flint shouted. The 2 armed men spun toward the sound of his voice. The one in front raised his rifle, but Flint was already aiming. He squeezed the trigger and put a round through the man's calf, dropping him to the floor with a yell of pain. The rifle clattered out of his hands and skidded across the tile. The second man was faster. He brought his weapon up and fired a burst in Flint's direction, the rounds tearing through boxes of cereal on the shelf beside him. Flint dove to the side as Butler stepped into the gap and returned fire. Butler's first shot caught the man in the chest. The second hit him in the neck. He went down hard, his rifle clattering against the floor as his body crumpled between the shelves. He didn't move again. The store erupted. The man in the hunting vest stumbled backward from the fire exit, his hands raised as if that would undo what he had just done. The woman screamed, dropping to her knees beside the dead man and yelling at the soldiers. "You killed him! You murdered him!" she screamed. Several of the other civilians rushed over from the deli area, drawn by the gunfire and the screaming. When they saw the dead man on the floor and the wounded one clutching his leg, the mood in the store shifted fast. A few of the men in the group stepped forward, their fists clenched and their faces red with anger. One of them picked up a can from a nearby shelf and looked like he was weighing whether to throw it. "Everybody stop!" Flint commanded. His voice cut through the noise, loud enough and sharp enough to freeze most of the group in place. He kept his rifle lowered but visible, making sure everyone understood the situation without him having to point the weapon at a civilian. "He came through that door with a rifle, aimed it at me and my partner, and pulled the trigger," Flint said, his voice firm but controlled. "We gave him every chance to stand down. He chose not to. That is not on us." "He was trying to protect his town," one of the men in the crowd shouted. "Then he should have put the gun down when he had the chance," Flint replied. He pointed down at the man he had shot in the leg, who was writhing on the tile and gripping his calf. The wound was similar to Ralph's, painful but not life-threatening. The man's rifle was several feet away, well out of reach. "This man had the same weapon, aimed at the same soldiers, and he's still breathing," Flint said. "You want to know why? Because the second I had a shot, I put him down without killing him. So before you start calling us murderers, take a good look at the man who's still alive and ask yourself if the people outside would have done the same for any of us." The crowd went quiet. A few of them looked down at the wounded man, then over at the dead one. The anger was still there, but the edge had dulled just enough to keep the situation from boiling over. One of the men who had stepped forward unclenched his fists and took a step back, pulling a younger man beside him back as well. Flint let the silence hold for a moment, letting his words settle before continuing. "I'm not your enemy. None of us are," Flint said. "There is something very real and very dangerous happening out there, and the people in that parking lot shooting at us are burning time that none of us have. So I need you to stay calm, stay put, and let us handle this." The woman on the floor was still crying over the dead man, and the man in the hunting vest stood with his back against the wall, his face drained of color. He looked like a man who had just realized that the consequences of his actions were going to be a lot worse than he had imagined. Flint turned to Butler. "Stay here and watch them. Nobody leaves, nobody touches a weapon, and that door stays shut." "What about those two?" Butler asked, gesturing to the man in the vest and the woman. Flint walked over to the man in the hunting vest, who flinched as the sergeant approached. Flint grabbed him by the collar and pushed him down to a seated position against the wall, then did the same with the woman, placing her beside him. "You two sit right here and don't move," Flint said. "When this is over, you're going to answer for what you just did. But right now, I've got bigger problems than you." Neither of them argued. The fight had gone out of both of them the moment the bullets started flying. Flint looked back at Butler one more time, getting a nod of confirmation before heading toward the stockroom. The gunfire at the front of the store had intensified, which meant Davis and the others were still trading shots with the main group outside. Morris was still holding the loading dock, which was silent for the moment. The sergeant pushed through the stockroom and out the back door onto the loading dock. The alley was clear, the two flankers having already made their way inside before being dealt with. He paused on the dock for a moment, listening for any additional movement from the strip mall or the surrounding area. When he was satisfied that no more surprises were waiting, he dropped off the dock and moved along the back of the building, heading west toward the parking lot. If he could get behind the group in the lot, he could force them into a crossfire between himself and the soldiers at the front of the store. It was risky, and if the men outside spotted him before he was in position, he would be caught in the open with nowhere to go. But the standoff wasn't going to end on its own, and every minute they spent pinned down was a minute they weren't spending on finding the missing soldiers or getting to the high school. Flint checked his magazine as he moved along the wall. He was running lower on ammunition than he would have liked, but he had enough to make an impact if he picked his shots carefully. The concrete block wall of the grocery store was cool against his shoulder as he sidled toward the corner, the muffled sound of gunfire growing louder with each step. He reached the corner of the building and pressed his back against the wall, listening to the exchange echoing from the front of the store. The shots from outside were coming in rapid bursts now, less disciplined than before, which told him the locals were getting rattled. They had come expecting an easy fight against a handful of soldiers trapped in a building. The sustained return fire from Davis and the others was telling them otherwise. Flint took a breath, steadied his grip on his rifle, and moved around the corner. Chapter 2. Flint moved around the corner of the building and found himself on the west side of the grocery store, looking out across a service road that separated the shopping area from a residential neighborhood. A row of houses sat just beyond the road, their backyards butting up against a chain-link fence that ran along the property line. From this angle, he had a clear view of the parking lot and the 3 pickup trucks that formed the barricade. The armed men were spread out behind the vehicles, most of them focused on the front of the store, where Davis and the others continued to return fire. Nobody was looking in his direction. Flint counted 8 men still in fighting positions. A couple more were crouched near the tailgate of the farthest truck, reloading their weapons. None of them were wearing any kind of body armor or protective equipment, just jeans, boots, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been in a real firefight. He crossed the service road at a sprint, vaulting the chain-link fence and dropping into the backyard of the nearest house. A plastic swing set and a scatter of children's toys filled the small yard, remnants of a life that felt like it belonged to a different world than the one unfolding around him. Flint moved through them quickly, stepping over a tricycle and cutting between the house and its neighbor to reach the front yard. The house provided a solid buffer between him and the parking lot. He crouched beside a bush near the front porch and peered around the corner. From there, he had a line of sight across the residential street and into the side of the parking lot. The closest truck was about 50 yards away, with 3 men positioned behind it. Their attention was locked forward, rifles pointed at the store. Shell casings littered the pavement around their boots, glinting in the light. One of the men leaned out from behind the truck bed and fired a burst toward the store before ducking back. Another was reloading, fumbling with his magazine in a way that told Flint he wasn't used to doing it under pressure. The third was the steadiest of the group, keeping his rifle shouldered and firing in measured single shots, but even he wasn't checking his flanks. Flint knelt behind a brick mailbox at the edge of the yard and raised his rifle. He took a breath, steadied his aim, and squeezed the trigger. The first round caught the nearest man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways and dropping him behind the truck's rear wheel. The other 2 reacted fast, ducking low and scanning wildly for the source of the shot. Flint put a second round into the bed of the truck, the metallic ring drawing more attention his way. "Over there, across the street," one of them shouted. The effect was what Flint had been counting on. Instead of staying behind their cover and maintaining pressure on the store, 4 of the men broke from the trucks and began moving toward his position. They crossed the parking lot in a loose group, rifles up and sweeping from side to side as they tried to locate him. Flint fired one more round, this time intentionally high, just to confirm his position for them. The shot cracked over their heads and they flinched, but it kept them moving in his direction and away from the store. Behind them, the remaining men at the trucks were now divided, some continuing to fire at the building, while others turned to watch their friends cross the service road. Davis seemed to recognize what was happening. The gunfire from inside the store intensified, the soldiers taking advantage of the thinned line to push the remaining men further behind their vehicles. Flint didn't stay to watch. He had pulled the group he wanted, and now he needed to move before they pinned down his position. He backed away from the mailbox and ran between the two houses, cutting through the backyard and hopping the fence into the yard behind it. The neighborhood was a grid of modest, single-story homes with small lots and narrow streets. Driveways held older vehicles, and the lawns were a mix of well-kept and overgrown. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and left their doors unlocked, which made the sound of gunfire echoing through it feel all the more wrong. Flint could hear the men behind him, their boots hitting pavement as they crossed the service road and entered the neighborhood. They weren't being quiet about it. Voices called out to one another as they spread out to search for him. They knew the streets and the layout of the houses, which gave them an advantage that Flint couldn't match. He moved quickly down an alley that ran between two rows of houses, keeping his footsteps light on the gravel surface. A dog barked from inside one of the homes as he passed, the sound making him wince. Any noise was a signal to the men hunting him. Flint emerged from the alley onto a cross street and paused behind a parked van, scanning in both directions. To his left, the street was empty. To his right, about 30 yards down, two of the men appeared from between houses and began jogging up the sidewalk in his direction. He ducked low and moved behind the van, crossing the street and cutting through another front yard. A wooden fence blocked his path, but it was only chest high. He grabbed the top rail and pulled himself over, landing in a backyard that was mostly dirt and dead grass. A rusted charcoal grill and a stack of old tires sat against the back of the house. Voices reached him from the other side of the fence, close, within a house or two of his position. The men were working in pairs, leapfrogging through the neighborhood in a pattern that suggested at least some of them had hunting experience. They were patient, methodical, and moving with the confidence of people who believed they had their prey cornered. Flint stayed low and moved along the back of the house, stopping at the far corner to listen. The voices had gone quiet, which was worse than hearing them. Silence meant they were being careful, and careful men were harder to predict. He glanced back the way he had come, half expecting to see a rifle barrel poking over the fence. The yard was empty, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. He cut across the next property, ducking under a clothesline strung between two metal poles. A screen door on the back porch of the house banged in the breeze, the rhythmic slapping of wood against the frame loud enough to cover his footsteps as he moved. He used the sound to his advantage, timing his steps to match the door's rhythm as he crossed through the yard. As he reached the fence line at the far end, a shout came from somewhere behind him, 2 streets back. The words were muffled by distance, but the tone was clear. They had found his trail, probably the scuff marks on the fence he had vaulted, or the footprints in the dirt yard. The hunt was tightening. Flint kept moving, working his way south through the backyards. He crossed 2 more properties, vaulting a low stone wall and skirting around a garden shed before reaching a house that stood out from its neighbors. The exterior was partially stripped, with sections of siding removed and stacked in the front yard. A dumpster sat in the driveway, filled with construction debris. Scaffolding lined one side of the building, and the front door was propped open with a cinder block. The house was clearly in the middle of a renovation. He moved to the front and slipped through the open door, stepping into what had once been a living room. The interior was gutted. Drywall had been torn off most of the walls, exposing the wooden studs and wiring beneath. Drop cloths covered sections of the floor, and power tools sat on makeshift workbenches made from sawhorses and plywood. A fine layer of sawdust covered everything, and the air smelled like fresh-cut lumber and joint compound. A radio sat on a windowsill, turned off but plugged into an extension cord that ran along the baseboard. 2 men in work clothes were standing in what appeared to be the kitchen area, pouring coffee from a thermos into paper cups. They looked up in surprise as Flint came through the doorway with his rifle, their faces going from confusion to alarm in a fraction of a second. One of them raised his hands instinctively, sloshing coffee across the plywood workbench. "You need to leave, right now," Flint said. "What the hell, man?" one of them said, nearly dropping his cup. "There are armed men in the neighborhood and they're heading this way. You do not want to be here when they arrive," Flint said. He kept his rifle pointed at the floor, not wanting to terrify them any more than he already had. "Go out the back, head south, and don't stop until you're a few blocks away." The two workers looked at each other, then back at the soldier, standing in their job site with an assault rifle and blood on his uniform. The distant sound of gunfire from the grocery store seemed to confirm everything Flint was saying. They didn't need to be told a third time. Both men set their cups down and moved quickly toward the back of the house, disappearing through a rear door that led out into the backyard. Flint heard their footsteps fade as they put as much distance between themselves and the house as they could. Flint moved through the stripped interior, checking sightlines from the windows. The missing drywall and exposed framing meant he could see through the walls in places, which gave him better awareness of the surrounding area than a finished house would have. It also meant that the walls offered next to nothing in terms of stopping bullets, but he would deal with that problem when it came. The layout was straightforward. The front door opened into what had been the living room, which connected to the kitchen through a wide archway. A hallway ran from the kitchen toward the back of the house, passing 2 bedrooms and a bathroom before ending at the rear exit the workers had used. Most of the interior doors had been removed and were leaning against the walls in a stack, leaving the rooms open and connected. Flint noticed a toolbox sitting open on one of the sawhorses. He grabbed a handful of screws from a tray inside and scattered them across the floor near the back hallway. They were small enough to be hard to spot in the sawdust, but anyone stepping on them would make enough noise to give away their position. It wasn't much, but in a fight where every advantage mattered, he would take what he could get. He positioned himself near a window on the north side of the house, where he had a view of the street and the yards he had just come through. The neighborhood was quiet for the moment, the only sounds being the distant gunfire from the grocery store and the occasional bark of the dog he had passed earlier. Flint checked his ammunition. He had 1 full magazine and roughly half of the one currently in his rifle. If this turned into a prolonged exchange, he would be in trouble. A minute passed, then another. The silence was almost worse than the noise because it meant the men were being smart about their approach. They weren't rushing in blind. They were taking their time, checking houses, working their way through the block systematically. Flint heard a creak from somewhere outside, the sound of weight on wood. He moved to a window on the east side and spotted movement 2 houses down. A figure crossed between a shed and a back fence, rifle in hand, moving low and deliberate. A second figure appeared a moment later, taking up a position at the corner of the neighboring house. 2 more appeared on the street out front, moving along the sidewalk with their weapons sweeping from house to house. They stopped when they noticed the scaffolding and the open front door. One of them pointed at the dumpster in the driveway, then at the door. The other nodded. The 4 men began closing in on the house from 2 directions. The pair on the street approaching from the front, while the 2 in the backyards moved toward the rear. They moved with the coordination of men who had hunted together before, each one covering the other's movement as they tightened the noose around the property. Flint stepped back from the window and moved to the center of the house, positioning himself behind a load-bearing wall that ran down the middle of the structure. It was the only thing in the house with enough substance to slow down a rifle round, and it gave him sight lines to both the front door and the back hallway. He glanced down at the floor, confirming the scattered screws were in place near the hallway entrance. Through the exposed studs on the south wall, he could see the shadows of the 2 men in the backyard shifting as they approached the rear door. Out front, the wooden porch creaked under the weight of the other pair as they stepped up to the entrance. He could hear their footsteps now, boots on the wooden porch out front, and the crunch of gravel from the backyard. One of the men on the porch whispered something to his partner, the words too low to make out, but the tone unmistakable. They were getting ready to breach. Flint raised his rifle and steadied his breathing, preparing himself for what was about to happen inside these bare walls. Chapter 3. Flint stood behind the load-bearing wall with his rifle raised, listening as the 4 men closed in on the house from both sides. The porch boards groaned under the weight of the pair approaching the front, and the scrape of boots on dirt told him the other 2 were nearly at the back door. He had seconds to decide how he wanted this to go. These weren't zombies. They were people, misguided and dangerous, but still people. One man was already dead at the grocery store, and 2 more injured. The thought of adding to that count sat heavy in his chest, even as his finger rested against the trigger guard. Flint made his decision. He dropped behind the wall and called out, his voice carrying through the gutted house with enough volume to reach all 4 of them. "I know you can hear me, so listen up," Flint shouted. "I'm a sergeant in the United States Army, and I am not your enemy. There is something happening in this town that is a hell of a lot worse than a handful of soldiers asking questions at a grocery store. And if you don't put your weapons down and talk to me, you're going to find out what it is the hard way." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the distant gunfire from the grocery store and the faint creak of the house settling around them. Then, a voice came from the front porch, rough and hostile. "You came into our town with guns and started shooting our people," the man said. "You don't get to tell us what to do." "The man at the store pulled a gun on me first," Flint replied. "I shot him in the leg. He's alive, being treated, and he's going to stay alive. That should tell you something about what kind of soldiers we are." "It tells me you're a lousy shot," a different voice said from the backyard, followed by a couple of low laughs. Flint let out a breath through his nose. He shifted his weight behind the wall, adjusting his angle so that he could see the front door through the exposed studs. "I'm serious. Whatever you think is going on, you've got it wrong," Flint said. "Those soldiers that came to town earlier weren't here to take your people away. They were trying to save them. There's a virus spreading through this country, and anyone with A-type blood is going to get sick. When they die, they come back as one of those things you've been hearing about on the news. The violent ones." "Government lies," the voice from the front said. "You people release something and then show up pretending to fix it. We've seen this before." "You haven't seen anything like this before," Flint said. "Nobody has." "He's stalling," one of the men at the back called out to the others, probably waiting for his buddies to show up. "I don't need my buddies," Flint replied. "What I need is for you to use your heads for 5 seconds. You've got sick people in this town, right? People running fevers, people who can barely stand up. How many of them have A-type blood?" The question hung in the air. Nobody answered, but the pause that followed told Flint that his words had landed somewhere close to the mark. He pressed on. "That's not a coincidence, and when those people die from that fever, they're not staying dead. I've seen it with my own eyes, and so have a lot of other people in a lot of other towns just like this one. So you can keep pointing your guns at me, or you can let me help before it's too late." Another stretch of silence followed. For a brief moment, Flint thought he might actually be getting through. Then the voice from the front porch came back, and whatever crack had formed in the man's resolve had sealed shut. "Save it, soldier boy. We're done talking," the man replied. Flint heard the front pair shift their weight, the porch boards creaking as they prepared to enter. From the back of the house came the metallic click of a rifle's safety being disengaged. The screws he had scattered in the hallway would give him a warning when the rear pair entered, but that warning would only buy him a second at most. "I'm going to say this one time," Flint called out, his voice dropping to a harder register. "If you come through those doors, I will put you down. I don't want to, and I've been doing everything I can to avoid it since I got to this town. But if you force my hand, I will not hesitate. So take a second and think about whether this is really the hill you want to die on." The silence stretched for several long seconds. Flint could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, each thud counting down the moments before this turned into something nobody could walk away from cleanly. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, his palms damp with sweat against the stock. Through the studs, he could see the shadow of one of the men on the porch shifting from foot to foot, the kind of nervous movement that came right before a decision was made. "Boys, he's one guy with a rifle," the voice from the front said. "Let's get this done." The front door flew open and the lead man came through in a rush, his rifle sweeping the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a canvas jacket and a ball cap pulled low over his eyes. Behind him, the second man entered a step later, moving to the right to create space between them. Both of them were scanning the gutted interior, their eyes adjusting to the dim light and the skeletal framework of the exposed walls. At the same time, the crunch of screws underfoot came from the back hallway as the rear pair made their entry. The small metallic sound gave Flint the fraction of a second he needed to confirm their position without looking. Flint rose from behind the wall, took aim at the lead man coming through the front door, and squeezed the trigger. The round hit the man's center mass. He staggered backward, his rifle dropping from his hands as his legs gave out. He collapsed against the doorframe and slid to the floor, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. The ball cap tumbled from his head and rolled across the sawdust-covered floor. The second man at the front froze for a split second, staring at his fallen companion. That hesitation was all Flint needed. He swung his rifle toward the man, who snapped out of his shock and dove behind the plywood workbench, firing wildly in Flint's direction as he went. The rounds tore through the exposed studs around Flint's position, sending splinters and sawdust into the air. He ducked back behind the load-bearing wall as the two men from the back hallway opened fire as well, their shots ripping through the thin interior of the house from the opposite direction. Flint pressed himself flat against the wall as bullets punched through the framing on both sides. The house was being torn apart around him, rounds splintering the studs and shredding the drop cloths. A power tool on one of the sawhorses exploded as a bullet struck it, sending chunks of plastic and metal across the room. The thermos the workers had left behind burst apart, spraying cold coffee across the plywood workbench. The noise was overwhelming, a constant roar of gunfire that made it impossible to think. He stayed low, making himself as small as he could behind the wall. Chunks of plaster and wood rained down on him from above as the rounds chewed through the ceiling joists. A section of exposed wiring was severed by a bullet, the cut end sparking briefly before going dark. The house groaned under the punishment, the structure protesting as its bones were shredded by rifle fire. He stayed put, knowing that the wall he was behind was the only thing keeping him alive. The shooters on both sides were firing in sustained bursts, filling the house with lead in what amounted to a killing box. If he moved in either direction, he would be cut down before he made it 2 steps. The firing continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably less than 30 seconds. Magazines emptied, and Flint heard the distinct sound of men reloading, the metallic clicks and shuffles that came with swapping out spent ammunition. The brief lull gave him a window, and he considered making a move toward the front door, while the shooters were occupied. But before he could act, something changed. The gunfire resumed, but it wasn't aimed at him. The shots were directed outward, toward the street and the backyard. The pattern was different too, frantic and panicked, rather than the controlled bursts that had been tearing through the house moments earlier. The man behind the workbench scrambled to his feet and ran toward the front door, firing as he went. Not at Flint. Past him, through the open doorway and into the front yard. Then he heard it, moaning. Not one voice, but many, rising from outside the house in a chorus that was becoming all too familiar. The sound was accompanied by screaming. "What the hell? What the hell are those things?" The shout came from somewhere near the front porch, followed by a rapid string of gunshots. More screaming erupted from the backyard, mixed with the guttural moans of the creatures and the heavy slap of bodies colliding. Flint moved to the window on the north side of the house and pressed himself against the frame, peering out through the dust and debris that hung in the air. The street outside had transformed. Dozens of zombies were pouring into the neighborhood from the direction of the main road, running at full speed toward the sound of the gunfire that had been echoing through the residential blocks. The creatures moved in a loose wave, some sprinting down the sidewalk, while others cut through yards and between houses, all converging on the renovation house and the men around it. The man who had been behind the workbench was now on the front porch, firing his rifle as fast as he could pull the trigger. His shots were wild, some finding their marks, but most going wide as the creatures closed the distance. For every ghoul that dropped, 3 more appeared behind it, drawn by the noise and the promise of prey. One of the men from the backyard came tearing around the side of the house, running for the street. He made it 10 yards before a zombie tackled him from behind, driving him face first into the pavement. His screams were cut short as more creatures piled onto him, their combined weight pinning him to the ground. The man on the porch ran out of ammunition and fumbled with his pockets, trying to find a spare magazine. He never got the chance. 2 ghouls reached the porch steps and launched themselves at him, one grabbing his arm while the other clamped its jaws around his shoulder. He went down hard, his empty rifle clattering across the porch boards as the creatures dragged him to the ground. His screams carried through the open front door, filling the house before being drowned out by the moaning of the horde closing in around him. On the other side of the house, the 4th man was backing up against the rear fence, firing his last rounds into the approaching horde. Each shot dropped a creature, but the gaps in the line were filled before the bodies hit the ground. When his rifle clicked empty, he turned to climb the fence, but a ghoul reached him before he could get a foot up. It grabbed his jacket and pulled him backward into the waiting arms of half a dozen more. Flint stood at the window, watching as the men who had been hunting him were overwhelmed in a matter of seconds. The zombies swarmed over them with the same savage efficiency he had witnessed in Wichita and in Shreveport before that. No hesitation, no mercy, just the relentless drive to feed. Within moments, the screaming stopped. The moans didn't. Flint pulled back from the window and pressed his back against the wall, gripping his rifle as he processed what had just happened. The creatures outside numbered in the dozens, with more still streaming in from the main road. The gunfire from the renovation house and the fight in the neighborhood had acted like a dinner bell, pulling every ghoul in the surrounding area to this exact location. He looked toward the front door, which was still open, the body of the man he had shot lying motionless in the frame. Beyond it, the porch and front yard were crawling with creatures that were still tearing into the fallen men. The back of the house was no better, the sounds from the yard making it clear that the rear exit was just as compromised. Several of the ghouls on the porch lifted their heads, blood dripping from their mouths as they seemed to sense fresh prey nearby. One of them turned toward the open front door, its vacant eyes scanning the interior of the house. Flint froze, pressing himself tighter against the wall, not daring to breathe as the creature stared into the gutted living room. After a moment, another sound from down the street pulled its attention away, and the ghoul turned back to join the others. But Flint knew it was only a matter of time before one of them wandered inside,